Welcome back, AI curious folk, to AI Ramblings Daily Podcast, episode 107. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I'm Michael Parekh, your human AI guide. Again, as usual, Monday is starting off with a bang. Today's theme are the AI political football wars are accelerating. And I want to go through three events as usual, along with my takes on some of the core drivers politically around AI and how it differentiates what's going on here versus what's going on in China. So the first item I want to talk about, and there's a couple of very important articles in the show notes that I'll have. One is by Bloomberg talking about the rising amount of AI debates and political fundraising that's going on against AI data centers, which is all building up as a big issue in the federal, state, and local elections going into the midterms this year. Hundreds of millions of dollars being raised on both sides of that issue. Obviously, one side funded by big tech, the tech founder billionaires. On the other side, a lot of local, state, and federal resistance around data centers by communities. And that is an important issue, obviously, in terms of US's AI leadership versus China, since that's a geopolitical take out there. And the overall numbers are interesting here. The tech community has managed to raise at least 2x the amount of political action funds on basically supporting data centers, 2x the amount that the same group or a similar group raised for the crypto legislation a couple of years ago that managed to make a lot of changes pro crypto in the US and actually managed to topple a senior Democratic senator in that effort, Sherrod Brown. And this time, the monies involved are at least 2x, $270 million or more, relative to less than half that for the crypto wars. So that by itself is important. Against that are a lot of local and state regional protests that are coordinated on the data center by data center opposition, especially for the power input of these things. And so that is an important element to keep in mind as we go into these elections. The other thing that's also happening as part of the first event in terms of these political footballs, as it were, is that the leading Democratic senator on the Mark Warner has just introduced a bill on AI agents. And here it's actually a very creative piece of legislation. He doesn't have the bipartisan support that he would need to kind of advance this meaningfully, but it's the first interesting AI agents regulatory effort out of the Senate in a bill, and it'll likely take a couple of years. But there is an element here that is of note, which I want to just highlight. It's basically a popular theory around a duty of loyalty built in, that the AI agent should be loyal to its user rather than its owner. And this is a very important dynamic. Even as I use services like Claude and ChatGPT, I'm often not sure whether the advice that the agent is giving me, Claude or ChatGPT or Google Gemini for that matter, is it biased toward its corporate owner, or is it really looking out for my interests? Well, there is a fiduciary concept, duty of loyalty, in existing law, and they're trying to apply this to AI agents, which I think is a clever and novel approach, long shot in terms of its passage, because obviously it's going to be totally fought against by the industry, and by the time it goes through the processing cycle of from a bill to a piece of legislation, it'll get modified. But it's interesting that this battle is also starting. It goes beyond the midterm election stuff around the AI data centers. But those two components, I think, are important to kind of keep in mind as the first event that we're talking about. And it's a long race. My take here is that it will take a lot of time, but some of the ideas are interesting, that we need to figure out how to have loyalty to the user horizontally on AI agents, as opposed to the vertical interests of the specific domains, specific companies, etc. The second event I want to talk about today is that US and China are taking very different views on the leading AI models. In the US, you've already had the White House basically stop about now going into its third week Anthropic from releasing its latest Mythos and Fable models. There's word that they may release the flexibility on the Fable models this week. They've already allowed some release of Mythos to selected gated customers that the US government approves. They're taking a similar approach, apparently, with OpenAI's latest GPT 5.6 models. And all of this is a marked change in the White House's approach, which has been very pro AI, laissez faire under David Sachs, the prior AI czar who just left. And now the administration seems kind of almost taking a 180, basically prioritizing AI security, cybersecurity over the interests of the industry to move forward with their models. They've been on a breakneck pace to basically outdo each other almost daily and weekly. That has been markedly slowed down, especially as Anthropic, as I said, is now going into essentially the third week of what I call the blip 2.0, where the government basically stopped their latest models from being released for all practical purposes. That is in marked contrast to what's going on in China, where there's a whole host of open source models and new ones are kind of frenetically coming up almost every week, it seems. The latest one is Z.AI. I wrote about them a couple of days ago, and they're matching and surpassing some of the benchmarks on Mythos, et cetera, especially on cybersecurity, et cetera. And so the Chinese government is not as focused on the cybersecurity concerns, obviously. And because those models are open source, the whole world can access them and see what makes the insides work. It's a very different approach than what the US is taking, where the two leading companies are basically closed model companies. Their weights in the models are secrets, obviously very valuable secrets, given that both of them are targeting trillion plus dollar IPOs later this year or next year. And so it's a very demarcated approach by the US versus China, while both are in this AI space race together. And that's a very interesting dynamic that we have not seen yet. The third thing I want to just highlight, and this is just a little bit more of a tactical advantage potentially for OpenAI, when there have been several pieces that have analyzed the details of the 5.6 release from OpenAI versus what we know about Anthropic on the Mythos and Fable side. And it looks like these OpenAI models, even though they're almost equivalent in capability as Mythos and Fable, they seem to have less of cybersecurity concerns than Anthropic's in the nitty-gritty details. Who knows if that'll last, if more details come up. But that seems to be a bit of a tactical advantage for OpenAI relative to its effort to catch up to Anthropic and potentially surpass it. As you know, there's been rumors that they may delay their IPO into 2027 rather than 26. But that horse race is an important one. So that's the third thing I wanted to highlight. My overall take on all of this is that there's just a great array of known and unknown political fights that are ahead on the US side, with a lot of qualitative issues to be weighed in terms of what can move the AI ball forward in the US or slow it down. And it's very tough to quantify all of that as investors, given the IPOs coming up, et cetera. And that uncertainty is very different than what we had in the US even 6 months ago, and very different than what the Chinese companies, which are also racing against the US, and they've got a number of IPOs also over there, are the way they're approaching and competing with the US. And so this higher uncertainty introduced to global access to these latest AI models from the frontier labs is a new variable. We've not seen it either in this AI tech wave or in prior waves. And that is a noticeable thing that could slow down how fast AI ramps in the US versus the rest of the world. And it's an important dynamic, and it needs clarity sooner than later. Right now, we are on a week by week, now third week since the blip 2.0, where we don't have clear answers. And that is a marked difference that I wanted to highlight, that, of course, here on Reset to Zero and ARD will keep a close eye on. So to be noted and watched. Let's move now to the Gadget AI section today. I want to talk today about robotaxis. There was a new comprehensive report on the progress robotaxis are making around the world, which I'll have in the show notes. And the quick punch to the data, and I've written a lot about this, that robotaxis are at least 3 to 5 years ahead of the market enthusiasm for that. We've already seen Tesla trade at $1 trillion extra market cap, half of that coming from enthusiasm over humanoid robots, its Optimus program, and the other half from robotaxis. And the reality is, even with the latest numbers in June, we're talking about thousands of cars deployed versus car metrics in the whole of US in the tens of millions. It's going to be at least in 2036 or so before we see a 1% penetration in units in terms of robotaxi units around the world in unit basis, maybe 2% on passenger miles traveled, even with the substantial lead that China again has on robotaxis versus the US. Their quality of their cars may be a little bit behind in terms of navigation, but because of their manufacturing ecosystems and so on, they're ahead of the US on these grounds. Even Waymo uses a Chinese company at the base for its latest cars, the Voyager, that they're using for their multi-sensor vehicles. So as excited as the markets are for robotaxis, it's still going to take longer than we think. And this is the Gadget AI thing that I wanted to highlight for today. Again, there's a lot of details in the specific articles that are mentioned in the show notes. That takes us to the questions of the day. One major question is, what's my best robotaxi experience? When it works, these things are magical, and I've tried Waymo and the others, and so they are fascinating, but it still comes across as a novelty experience. They're still not mainstream yet. And this leads into the second question: how could these robotaxis be better? The biggest anxiety in these cars I've tried them in Austin or San Francisco or LA, is that there is a little bit of anxiety around when these things pick you up. Do they understand where to stop and pick you up? And particularly on the drop-off points, especially if it's at the airport, these vehicles are still not quite all tuned as to where to stop next to your door or gate. It's much better to deal with humans on those kinds of things. Also, there are some other elements like human drivers. A third of the time we take cars are to and from the airport, and human drivers by and large will come out and help you with your luggage, putting it in the car, out of the car. Obviously, robotaxis can't do that. So there's a lot of societal things that are not yet incorporated into what we think of these things, and the pricing of these robotaxis are still in the US at least, equal to, if not greater than human taxi drivers. So that's my other area where I think robotaxis could be better. They should be a lot cheaper, and they're not. And there's a long way to go, literally years before robotaxis are a mainstream thing. But I thought it'd be important to talk about it this show because of the latest data that's out in the Bloomberg article. Okay, so that basically covers it for today on ARD 107. Today's Reset to Zero topic 1132 is on the latest advanced AI packaging technology from TSMC called CoWoS, which is shaping up to be the next big supply constraint for AI, besides memory, besides GPUs, CPUs. These packaging technologies where TSMC is one of the leading providers is another layer of expense and capability that exists over in Asia, but that has not been replicated in the US. And that is another short supply element to the broader issue of chips supply for AI and other technologies, whether it's in data centers or on local devices like computers and smartphones. So that continues to be an issue. So you will take a look at that article if you're interested. As usual, I want to thank you all for joining us, AI curious folk. Stay tuned.